Welcome, everyone. Hello, and thanks for joining today. I am Addie Olson, the chair of the Young Leaders Executive Board for the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Today, we are very excited to speak with Foreign Service Officer Adam Vaught, who has recently navigated a career switch and the Foreign Service Officer selection process. Also, as a heads up, today's program will be recorded. And after I introduce Adam, I have a few questions for him to kick things off, and then we'll have at least 15 to 20 minutes for audience Q&A, where you guys can ask all the questions you have to Adam. We'll use the raise your hand feature, and then I'll ask you to come off mute and you can ask your question at that time. And we want this to be as interactive as possible, so please turn on your cameras. Anyways, on to Adam. Adam is an American diplomat. He's posted in Shanghai, China, but is currently serving in Doha, Qatar, working on Afghan refugee resettlement. Prior to joining the Foreign Service in 2020, he spent a decade and a half working in the luxury travel industry in positions ranging from adventure tour guide to senior management. Originally, he's from Southern California. Adam has lived in Japan, Cambodia, Argentina, Ecuador, and Cuba. Wow. And prior to joining Foreign Service in Shanghai, he spent 10 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from UCLA and a master's in international development from Georgetown. He's joining us today from his hotel room in Doha. Thank you so much for joining us despite the time change, Adam.
No problem at all, and thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, let's kick things off. First question I have is to ask you to talk a little bit more about your background prior to joining the Foreign Service.
Sure. And from my side, thank you all for joining. It's exciting to see that there is excitement about the Foreign Service or even about changing careers. So I'm excited to be here tonight. In terms of my background, the short version is I was kind of like a bit of a nomad in my 20s after finishing undergrad. I spent most of my 30s working in luxury travel, but desk jobs, living in the Bay Area. And then my career with the Foreign Service began right about the time that I turned 40. Big monumental birthday and a big career change at the same time. So more specifically, after graduating, I grew up in Southern California, had like a very sheltered existence in the suburbs in Southern California. I hadn't gone abroad or really traveled much until I did a study abroad program. I was 19. I went to Barcelona. I remember having kind of an epiphanal travel moment that I'm sure many people can relate to, of walking around and in Barcelona, 2-3 weeks into the program and just thinking like, wow, this is the most amazing place in the world. And then having a quick realization of like, this is the only place outside of California that I've really seen. And there was so much more out there to see and discover. And so it really sparked an interest in me in just getting out and traveling and seeing more and experiencing more. And so I did as much study abroad as I could when I was an undergrad, anything that was still kind of propelling me towards graduation. And then once I graduated, I realized I couldn't use studying as an excuse to travel anymore. I would need to find someone to pay me to travel. And so I joined the JET program, which some people might be familiar with. It's teaching English in Japan, sponsored by the Japanese government. Really amazing experience for me at the time. I was 24. I lived there for 2 years. And that just led me down a path. It's the type of thing where kind of whatever industry you're in, you're obviously going to hear more about opportunities within that industry. And for me, like living abroad and teaching English in Japan, it just became almost, there's like momentum behind you to just continue living that type of life. So after 2 years of teaching in Japan, I ended up going to work for a small nonprofit in Cambodia. I did that for a while. Then I started doing tourism consulting. And I was just kind of bouncing around. This was kind of my late 20s. And I found myself for about 2 or 3 years working for a nonprofit in Cambodia, working as a cycling tour guide for a company based in the Bay Area, and then picking up consulting jobs where I could. And it was all really amazing experience. But at some point around 28, I realized like I have zero direction in my life. Everything's really fun, but I don't really know what I'm doing. And it was at that point I decided to go back to grad school. Maybe not the best motivation to go to grad school, just to like try and figure things out, but probably fairly relatable. So you mentioned Georgetown, which I feel a little bit guilty anytime I talk about getting a master's from Georgetown, because the program I did was actually all in Buenos Aires. It was a program partnered with Georgetown and an Argentine university. And so for me, it was really just an excuse to go live in another country. And I came away with it with a Georgetown degree. But I lived in Argentina 2009, 2010. And that kind of culminated with me finally getting to a point where I felt like I was ready to move back home. I was in my early 30s at that point, moved up to the Bay Area. And when I came back to the US, I had this intention of, potentially going to DC, getting involved in international relations, international development. That's what I had studied in my master's degree. And it just didn't really work out. I think I was probably more impressed with my resume than anybody else was. So I'm applying to tons of jobs and just getting nothing in return, which was a good humbling experience. And the job I ended up getting was with a small travel company in the Bay Area that happened to have one of the first licenses to do tourism in Cuba. Through President Obama had started what he called the People to People program in Cuba. And I had the right combination of I spoke Spanish, I had experience leading tours, and I had actually been to Cuba before. And that kind of started this path of mine of working kind of desk jobs, what eventually turned into desk jobs in the Bay Area, working in the travel industry, which was really fantastic. I mean, it's an amazing lifestyle industry to be in. Your work trips end up oftentimes being really amazing, like going on African safaris and going to the Galapagos, and you consider it research for work. So that was really fantastic. But after about 10 years, I hit a point with that where I felt like I didn't really know where I wanted to go next. It had been really fulfilling for 10 years or so, about 15 if you include the leading tours and consulting work. But I just really had no idea what the next 5 to 10 years was going to look like. And there was nothing about that had me excited or feeling very inspired. And that was about the time that I started looking into the Foreign Service. And Addie, I had mentioned to you before the call, the process of applying for the Foreign Service. If there's anyone on the call who has actually gone through this process, you would know it's not like sending an application and then they hire you. For me, it was about 2 years from the time that I submitted my application, or I should say I signed up to take the test. And about 2 years later, I actually had a job. So it wasn't like a master plan of I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to join the Foreign Service. It was more of like kind of slowly phasing out of one chapter of my life, and kind of waiting for the okay to start a new one.
Wow. Yeah, that's a very exciting, like you were saying, international resume that you've had, for sure, prior to the Foreign Service. So my next question, which I think you kind of touched on, was what was your motivation for the Foreign Service? We were kind of talking before the call about the switch from, private sector to public sector, but what was it really that motivated you to go down this route?
Yeah, I think I had first learned about the Foreign Service and started, or at least kind of recognized it as a career option when I was in grad school in 2009, 2010. So it was, 10 years before I even joined. But it's one of those things that like, it was just a seed that planted somewhere back in my brain that like, this is something that seems really interesting. I remember in particular thinking like, wow, that's a job where they pay you to learn languages. Like that seems so amazing. I would say like I got sidetracked, or I went off in a different direction. And I really kind of fully immersed myself in the travel industry and really wanted to see how far I could take that. And I think when you're in the middle of that with whatever career you're in, there's certainly times when you kind of have blinders on and you're just focused on what's right in front of you. And I did that for a number of years. And then I started to get to this point of realization of, I don't think this is going to work for me in the long term. And that's, it's funny how things work, because right around that time, I was reconnecting with friends of mine from grad school, planning a birthday party for another one of our coworkers. And it put me back in touch with one of my good friends from grad school who was in the Foreign Service. And she was just finishing up her first tour, which was a border post in Mexico, which is a pretty common first tour. We have a lot of consulates and a lot of work to be done on the border in Mexico. And she was about to head off for 2 years in Paris. So obviously, there's an aspect of that that was quite appealing to me. And she was actually the one who really encouraged me. She kind of, I think I'd probably vented to her about where I was with my career and just feeling a little bit stuck. And she was saying, like, just take the test, go online, take a look at when they're offering it, take the test and see what happens. There's nothing to lose except for, I can't remember how much it costs, but it's not very expensive. And to me, that was like, yeah, that was great. I was, feeling somewhat stagnant in my career. And I think for me, just feeling like I was proactively doing something, it kind of, it alleviated some of that kind of feeling of stagnation, that I was kind of proactively putting myself out there and kind of who knows what's going to happen. And so I did. I happened to go online, and they were offering the test like 3 weeks from that day. But there happened to be a slot available in the Bay Area that I could go to, and I signed up for it. Again, anyone who's taken the test knows it's like there's a reading list that's 130 books long for the test. I mean, the joke is, like, it's not really a test you study for. You can't cram for it. You can watch as many episodes of Jeopardy as you want. That'll help a little bit. So I just, I did what I could. I read up on Supreme Court cases, and constitutional amendments were two things that I thought, like, there's a decent chance that, like, at least one or two questions will be about these things. Turns out there were no questions about either of them. But I went and took the test. The test has a fixed score. I think it's like 154 you have to get. And I ended up getting like a 156. So like I really just barely got by. But it was good enough to get by. And from that point, it's just kind of like, okay, this, I passed this first step, and now there's the next one ahead of me. And in that process, the next step is personal narratives that you have to write. It's these like 6 annoyingly short essays that you have to write. Once you do that, then you get invited for an in-person interview, which I ended up having to fly to Chicago to do that. But it's just this kind of hurry up and wait for this process. There's always another step in front of you. And having gone through it now, what I tell people is, it's really a matter of persistence. If it's something you want, I feel like most people can eventually get there. And knowing now kind of the path that some of my colleagues have taken, 2 years for me, actually, I think I got off pretty easy. That was fairly short. I mean, I know people who it was 6 years, 8 years that they spent taking the test, retaking the test. You get to the final step, and then you don't pass the in-person interview. You have to start all over again. And so from that standpoint, it's a pretty brutal process. But I do think that, people who really want it, if you're able to put in the time and be somewhat determined, I think I know a lot of stories of people who eventually got there. That said, for every one of those, there's probably a dozen people who, almost got there and then decided to go in a different direction.
Yeah, also that's a great point, definitely on persistence there. I want to talk about the career switch in general. I think all of us are aware of the great resignation that's happening, where a lot of people are resigning or switching careers, or looking for something new right now. I certainly have a handful of friends that are doing that right now. But obviously it's pretty challenging, and I think you doing it partway into a pretty well-developed career is commendable. But yeah, can you talk more about just the process of a career switch and the challenges, and is there anything you might do different next time, or advice you have?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think for everybody, we get to different phases with our jobs and with our careers. And I've certainly been in a position with a job where it's like, I'm done. Like, I need to get out of here. I need to move on. And when you're operating from that standpoint, it's like you're more focused on leaving the job you have than you are on what you're getting next. And I think that can oftentimes, it puts you in a position to maybe not make the best choice about, your next step. Obviously, what job you have, for most of us, there's like nothing we spend more of our waking hours doing than our job, which is a little depressing to think about. But, given that, it is something we should all take very seriously. And, we can all be so lucky to hopefully enjoy what we do and enjoy the people we do it with. And I've certainly operated from that position of like, I got totally burnt out or really stale in a work situation. And so you're focused on like, I need to get out of here. I need to do something different. In this case, and I think in part it is from like learning from my own mistakes in the past, is I wasn't quite at that point yet. I like I had recognized like I'm getting there, and I might be a year
Mm-hmm.
away, maybe even 6 months away. I don't know, but like I'm going to eventually be there, and so I need to make some sort of change. And I feel lucky that I was able to kind of identify that, and it led to me kind of like putting out feelers. And the Foreign Service was really just a feeler. Like, it's not something you can manifest overnight. It's something that it does take a lot of time. And I was, but during that process, I was also applying for other jobs, but I didn't feel that pressure of like, I have to make a change. I had like, I really wanted the job with
Mm-hmm.
the Foreign Service, but I was prepared at every step of the way that like, this might not work out. You submit your personal narratives and it goes off into the ether, and then you just wait for someone to respond, some form email that comes through and either says, congrats, you made it, or sorry, better luck next time. And every step of the way, I knew that I'd kind of mentally prepared myself for the possibility, like they could say no. I'm totally new to government, so all of this process was like very new to me. Um, and I just kind of felt like, all right, I'm going to do my best. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, I need to be okay with that. And so fortunately, like I hadn't gotten to that point with my job that I was just like, get me out of here. Because if that was the case, I think I would have been really devastated had I not got the job. But, I think, so for me, recognizing that I was heading in that direction and being proactive about kind of putting those feelers out in different ways. I had like, at the same time I was applying for the Foreign Service, I had like um, I had an experience applying for a job with Airbnb that like stretched out over 3 months. I was joking at the end of it. I think I had 13 interviews with 11 different people. But it was like, I was in that mindset of like, this is exciting. This is a good opportunity. If they offer me the job, I'll take it, but I'm not in a bad place. Like if they say no,
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. And after 3 months and 13 interviews and 11 different people, they ended up saying no. And it was kind of like, okay, nobody likes being said no to, and it was disappointing. But the fact that I wasn't quite at that point of like, I need to get out of this job. It didn't sting so bad. And I still had, the Foreign Service was still a possibility. It was still something to be excited about. So I don't know, I think, the actual career change itself is obviously a huge move, but I think as you're going through that process of trying to figure out what's coming next, a lot of it is just about like that feeling of like, okay, today I did something proactive. Today I took a positive
Mm-hmm.
step, whether it's applying for a job or doing some studying for the Foreign Service exam, or, having a call with somebody who's in a different industry, like an informational interview, something like that. Like, you can go to sleep at night feeling like, okay, I'm making progress. And so, fortunately for me, the path with the Foreign Service, it worked out in the end. Like I was offered the job, so it kind of felt like, oh, that was all worth it. Had they not offered me the job after, 18 months of waiting, I certainly would have been frustrated, and probably closer to that point with my previous job of, I need to get out of here. So, I mean, I feel incredibly fortunate. The timing for me, in so many ways, worked out very well. I was able to kind of wrap up my position with my former company. I worked there for about 5 years, and I was able to wrap that up and leave on good terms. I wasn't like itching to get out the door, and they weren't like, slamming it behind me. But I was also working in the luxury travel industry, and right when I left was right when the coronavirus hit. And I mean, so many horrible things have happened due to COVID. And the fate of the luxury travel industry is low on the list in terms of severity. But for anyone working in the industry, the industry's just been decimated. So
Yeah.
my last day at the company that I had worked at for 5 years, we actually had to lay off 80% of our staff, which was an awful way to go out. And fortunately, the company's still around and they're hiring people again, and things are picking back up. But for me, it was a recognition of like, wow, the timing ended up working out well. It's a good time for me to be transitioning into something else.
Yeah, wow. You really did time that well. Like that transition, I'm sure there's no way you could have planned for that, but I'm happy that worked out for you. And that's awesome advice about the career switch. I know. Yeah, it's hard to be in that frustrating position where you're like, I just really want to leave, but still want to find, best possible option going forward. So it's great advice. And we had a question from the chat, which is actually basically the next question I was going to ask. So thank you, Greg. He asked, what's the typical day for a Foreign Service officer? And I was just going to ask next for you to tell us about your current posting and how your experience has been so far.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess like long story short, as a Foreign Service officer for myself, so I'm a Foreign Service generalist. There's generalists and there's specialists. And when most people think of like the kind of the stereotypical diplomat. That's a generalist. So when I signed up, actually when I signed up to take the test back in 2018, one of the first questions they ask, it's like name, date of birth, and then it's what cone do you want to be in? And there's 5 different cones with the Foreign Service: political, economic, management, public diplomacy, and consular. The details of those are not very interesting. I won't get into it. But I'm a public diplomacy coned officer, which is basically you're in like a kind of PR type position for the US government, for better or worse. But just about every officer will start out in a consular position. And as a consular officer, like you're basically, you're doing visa interviews. It's like, I would jokingly say it's like, it's kind of the grunt work of an embassy or of a consulate. So for me, when I'm in Shanghai, which is where I'm posted to right now, my day, like I'm there typically 7:45 in the morning. And they say like windows up at 8. Windows up is like, you're literally pulling up a blind. Like think of the DMV. I'm pulling up a blind and I'm sitting at a desk with my computer, and like a Chinese applicant comes up. Because it's China and because it's Shanghai, it's oftentimes students who are applying for a student visa to go study at, name a US university. And you've got Chinese students applying to go there. So we do those interviews. And that is a bulk of my morning. If it's a busy day. China, in the pre-COVID times, it wasn't uncommon for China to do 3,000 interviews in one day, which is a pretty obscene amount relative to other embassies and consulates. It's one of the busiest, like one of the 5 busiest in the world. For me, I got to China in June of last year. The busiest days that I saw were about 1,000 during like the peak of summer, and that was mostly students. So we're not seeing a lot of tourist visas right now. And at that point, there weren't any because the US had restrictions on travel. Right now, those numbers are down significantly. So my colleagues that are still in China right now, and I'll be going back there once I finish my work here in Doha, it's the same thing. Like you show up in the morning, you're doing visa interviews. Once you're finished with the number of interviews for that day, you go back to your desk. It's typically around lunchtime. You come back from lunch and then you have back office work to do for the interviews. It's like, it's not glamorous in the slightest. You're just doing your homework and doing research about the applicants. Any cases that are overly complicated that you can't make a decision at the window, you then take back to your desk with you and you do some more research. And yeah, again, the specifics of that are not interesting, I promise you. So that's the bulk. That's the primary responsibility that I have in this job. And then there are tons of other side projects and side things to get involved with. I'm part of like the like Americans in Shanghai Council, which is a group that we like put on events for the community within the consulate. So there's opportunities like that. There's diversity and inclusivity council as well. There's lots of different things that you can get involved in if you want to. And so it's ways to fill your time. There are no shortage of options. And then it is a pretty standard, like it's 8 to 5. I'm not taking any work home with me, which is a huge change from like my previous life in the private sector. And it's shockingly nice. I had forgotten what it was like to have a relaxing Sunday night and not be like completely stressed out about what Monday was going to be like, and feeling like I have to prepare and I've got meetings I need to be ready for. And I have, now it's, you just enjoy a nice leisurely Sunday, roll into the office Monday morning and get back to work, which is really nice. And Shanghai, for anyone who's been to Shanghai is an amazing city. So there's no shortage of things to do after work. I would say it's certainly a different experience for if you're with your family in the Foreign Service versus if you're not with your family in the Foreign Service, or it's even more so if you have kids. And if you don't have kids, I'd say that's the big divide, at least in Shanghai. Most of the families with kids live a little bit outside of the city center, and they have houses that they live, like kind of like townhomes they live in. Whereas people that are single, or they're with their partners, or even in some cases with the partners and with like a young child, we live in apartments in the center of the city. And so, it's kind of like being like living in Manhattan. There is no shortage of things to do. So that's a typical day. Every Foreign Service officer has to do one consular tour. So most people do it their first tour. If it's not their first tour, it'll be their second. So you're going to do at least 2 years of like that type of work, doing visa interviews. There's also American Citizen Services, which is something that's offered in anytime. If you've ever been abroad and been to an embassy or a consulate, the people you dealt with, that's the American Citizen Services team. It's like if you have an emergency, God forbid you get arrested, if somebody dies, if you need a passport renewed, if you need an emergency passport, all of those types of things. So that also falls under the consular purview. I did a month working with that team. And then going forward in my career, the goal for me will be to be doing public diplomacy related positions. So I'm coming up on bidding for my next tour in the next couple months, and I'll try to get a position that is in my cone doing public diplomacy work, which is a little bit tougher to explain. I say that and I just gave like a 20-minute explanation of consular work, so that's not that easy to explain either. But the public diplomacy work is a lot of working with journalists. It's also going out to events like museum openings and things like that. But you're really kind of the face of the U.S. government in whatever city you're posted in or whatever country. So sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer.
Oh no, that's great. Thanks so much for that detailed insight. Ricky actually just asked a question in the chat, and I think it's pretty relevant to what we're talking about. She said, can you elaborate on the sense of public service that motivates your career? Why do you want to represent the U.S. abroad? Which sounds a lot like what you'll be doing in that public diplomacy cone.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, Ricky, your question sounds like the type of question they would ask you in the in-person interview. Like at some point 2 years ago, I was like memorizing answers to this question and like dreading when it was asked of me. And it's on that. I mean, you know, it's a little bit tricky, to be honest, at times. And that's one thing they bring up, and it's kind of like a tenet of this career. Like for me, thinking of like, I started this job at 40, and my goal is that 20 years from now, I'll retire at 60, and, you know, potentially move on to something else. So that means I will be in this position for, you know, 5 presidents, maybe 4 presidents, like different administrations, different ideologies, and, you know, the swing that you can see. And again, like to keep politics out of it completely, but you can imagine going from like Obama to Trump to Biden. You know, anyone who worked in the Foreign Service over that stretch of time is probably going to have fundamental disagreements with decisions that are being made one way or the other, depending on who you support, who you don't support. And so it's tricky. I mean, from my standpoint, I feel like I want to do my best job representing the United States. And I felt that as a responsibility just as an American living abroad. You know, I spent about 8 years in my 20s and early 30s living abroad. And you recognize that any country you go to, people have stereotypes that are oftentimes, you know, some positive, some negative. But for me, it's always been like, I want to represent the positive stereotypes. And I want to be someone who interacting with, if it's one single interaction I have with somebody, that they walk away and they think, oh, I met this American guy today. He was a really nice person. And I kind of take that with me to this job. And just wanting to be a good representative for our country and kind of highlighting the good things that we do, while at the same time being pretty clear about areas where I find disagreement or shortcomings with policy. And that can be tricky. I mean, I haven't been in a position yet in my short career where I found myself kind of fundamentally disagreeing with a policy choice, and being in a position where I have to kind of defend that. But I suspect that will happen. And you hear plenty of stories of people who, you know, they cut their career early because they find themselves in positions where like, I can't do this anymore. I don't agree with what's happening, and I don't want to be someone who's, you know, part of this policy. So it's tricky, and it's something I think a lot about. You know, kind of transitioning into what I'm doing here in Doha right now. We have like a big program right now to help Afghans who worked for the U.S. government get out of Afghanistan and get resettled. It's a super loaded situation, but the position that I have here, like I'm sitting down with the Afghans and doing their visa interview, and we're able to put visas in their passports and hand them their passports back. And I'm a small cog in this wheel, but I'm actually the one who gets to be there when they get their visa. And it's like the final step, and it's like, hey, you're going to the U.S. And it's really, it's emotional. I get emotional thinking about it. Like for these people, you know, I've interacted with a lot of them for a couple weeks since they arrived here in Doha. But for them, this journey to get here has been so much longer and so much more complicated. And I can't even imagine what they've gone through to get to this point. And so everything that happened with Afghanistan, very complicated. People have a lot of mixed feelings about it, completely understandably. I'm happy that I get to be a part of this aspect of it, where I feel like our government is trying to do the right thing, and helping these people out. But it is not without its complications, in terms of working for the US government and being a representative of the US government. Even just being here, like there's a running club that I've joined out here in Doha. And like when they like, and it's a really international group of people, super interesting people from all over the Middle East, Europeans, Aussies. And like when they find out that you work for the US government, they're like, oh, US government. Like you can tell there's a little bit of like, I'm not so sure about you. And like, I'm like, okay, I get it. And I have to be like, okay with the fact that like I represent the US government now. That is my job. And so for someone who is coming into this job as a 40-year-old or 41-year-old now, it's a pretty big shift. It's no longer just like, oh, I'm an American traveling. It's now like, oh, I have my like my badges that I use, and I'm an official with the U.S. government, and it's a different experience.
Oh yeah, that sounds incredible, and I can see the emotion in your face when you're talking about kind of what it means to you too. That's awesome. We are getting some questions in the chat, so I think I'm going to go ahead and transition to Q&A, so people in the audience can ask their questions. The first one was from Laura Mitchell. Laura, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi there. Thanks so much for all of your insight today. So yeah, I just had a question about, I'm married and wondering kind of what, if you're able to bring your spouse, and then, if there's any support for like finding them employment. And then I guess my other question was, I've heard that you have to a lot of times do a hardship post when you first start for a few years. And I was wondering kind of what, the general circumstances are around that.
Yeah, both very good questions. In terms of bringing a spouse, absolutely. There are certain posts where you would not be able to bring your spouse, but as my understanding is that that's typically not, those are not posts that like entry-level Foreign Service officers would be assigned to. So nobody that I know has been sent to Iraq or Pakistan. Those are the ones off the top of my head that I know. They're typically one-year posts, and you are typically not able to bring a spouse with you. Outside of that, yeah, every post you go to, you would be able to bring a spouse. With same-sex partners, that can be a little bit complicated, particularly in the Middle East. And I say that because I have a colleague of mine that ran into that issue. He was assigned to Kuwait and wanted to bring his partner with him, and they ran into some issues. So that can be a little bit complicated depending on the laws of the country you're being sent to. But I will say the Foreign Service works quite hard to make sure that like they can accommodate everyone, and that everyone is able to bring their spouse with them if they want to. And you also see like there are a couple people in my from my initial training class with like 3, 4, 5 kids. One guy had 5 kids, and they bring the whole family with them. I think for that's like depending on how you view it. I mean, some people I think feel like that's crazy. I can't like the thought of bringing your kids to Beijing, your 5 children to Beijing and enrolling them in school out there. And for other people, it's like, wow, what an amazing experience my kids will get to have. And so those opportunities are certainly there. I think the Foreign Service actively encourages it. In terms of opportunities for spouses to work, again, that's contingent on the country you go to. It's like bilateral work agreements is the buzzword that gets used. So being in China right now, as you can imagine, relationship between the US and China is complicated. We don't have a bilateral work agreement, so spouses aren't able to just go out and get jobs. So typically you'll have spouses that want to work will try and get jobs inside the consulate, inside the embassy. There are various options for that. It's not guaranteed. It's complicated because spouses often have to get the security clearance. Like my security clearance took me 7 months to get. So Addie and I were talking before the call about government bureaucracy. You'll see these situations where it's like, oh, we have a need in our office for someone to fill X position, and like so-and-so's husband has a background in this. He'd be perfect. I'm like, great, let's hire him. Fast forward like 9 months later, and that person's still waiting for a security clearance, and that job's still unfilled. So those types of complications can happen, and you can imagine on a more personal level, like if you're in that position, you're out there with your husband. Your husband's sitting at home all day, trying to keep occupied, waiting to find out if he can go to work. Like those types of dynamics, they put a strain on a relationship. And I say that because I've seen it firsthand, and it's something I think is pretty actively talked about in the Foreign Service about how challenging that can be. You know, whoever is there's what they call it the trailing spouse. Whoever is the trailing spouse that's following the person who's the diplomat, you're in a position of, you know, you have to be okay with, my partner's job is going to determine where we live. It's going to determine whether I can work or not. It's going to determine, like, specifically, like, the house I live in. You know, you get assigned housing, which you don't have a ton of say over. Granted, at least for me, Shanghai, the housing's amazing. I have no complaints. But you're giving up a lot of autonomy and a lot of ability to make decisions about your own life. And for some people that works, and for some people it definitely doesn't. So, I mean, I can expand on that if needed or desired. But your other question about hardship posts, you're not required to, and you're not even necessarily expected to. I think you're encouraged to serve in a hardship post. It's kind of one of those, like, it's good for your career to do that, but certainly not in the beginning. Everyone who gets hired, we're kind of under an umbrella of, they call it entry-level HR for our first 2 posts. So that's basically gonna take up the first 5 years of your career. Between the 2 posts will likely be 2 years apiece. And then you'll also have training, general trainings, which are as exciting as they sound, and then language training, depending on where you get posted to. So for me, going to China, I spent 8.5 months in full-time Chinese class before being sent to China. So all that to say, the first 5 years or so, while you're under entry-level HR and you're an ELO, the agency is full of acronyms, entry-level officer, you're typically not expected to go to a hardship post. Granted, everyone's definition of a hardship post is different. So what the department determines as a hardship post might not be the same as what you determine as a hardship post. Like I said, the border with Mexico, pretty popular place for people to go. I have a lot of friends who've served down there. And for some people, that's like the last place they want to go. On the flip side, friends of mine who've been in Ciudad Juarez are like, wow, it's actually surprisingly much better than people expect. And the benefit of doing a post like that for your first tour is that you're often rewarded with a post like Paris or something similar in your second tour. For me, being in Shanghai, I will probably have fewer options for those like cushy European posts for my second tour, because Shanghai is not really considered too much of a hardship post. Despite the fact that right now with COVID and all the restrictions, it's a lot more challenging to live there than it would be otherwise. I hope that answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for the transparency there for sure. The next question we had, I think you kind of answered. It's about, Andrew asked about, do you need to speak another language to join the Foreign Service? Or is that a factor at all when they're evaluating applicants?
Very good question. In the initial process of applying for the Foreign Service, I honestly have no idea the degree to which they take that into account. If I remember correctly, I think you have to fill out a super long online application talking about like places you've traveled and blah, blah, blah. I think on that application, they actually ask you to mention languages that you speak. And I think you like self-assess. I'm trying to remember something from almost 3 years ago. So if I get that wrong, forgive me. So I don't know the degree to which that factors in the beginning of the process. But once you pass your in-person interview, which is like the third step of the hiring process, then you are able to actually test with the department if you speak a foreign language. They will do a phone interview with you. And if you get above a certain level, and it's different for every language, the requirement for Chinese is much lower than the requirement for Spanish. But if you get over that certain level, you get basically bonus points towards your application. So it's a little bit complicated to get into, but there's like a scoring system for the final step of the process. When you do the in-person interview, you're given a score that's a maximum of 7. You have to get at least a 5.3 out of 7 based off of your full day interview. If you get that 5.3, you're added to a list. They call it the registrar. And that's where they pull people. That's like when they offer jobs, they pull them off of that register based off of their scores. So highest scores get offered first. If you speak a language, you get bonus points. So hypothetically, if you got a 5.5 on your in-person interview, you passed, you're on the register, but you're not guaranteed a job. You're on that register for 18 months. And as they go through and they have new training classes, they'll offer people positions based off of where you're ranked on that register. if you have that 5.5, but let's say you speak Spanish, you do the in-person or you do the phone interview with them and can prove to a satisfactory degree that you speak Spanish, you get a bonus 0.17 points. It's getting complicated, I'm sorry. So you'd have a 5.67. So that would bump you up. If you speak a language that they determine, I can't remember what the phrasing is, but like a particularly difficult language or one that they have a need for, which would be like Arabic, Mandarin, Pashto, Dari, I can't remember what the other ones are. You get that same bonus, but that bonus is 0.34 instead of 0.17. So all that to say, the calculations are not really that relevant, but you can get a bonus at that stage in the process. So I have heard stories of people who pass the final interview, which means they got like a 5.3 or a 5.4 on the final interview, but that's too low on the register for your name to ever come up. Because every time they have a new training class, they're pulling people who got like a 5.9, a 5.8, a 5.7. So they kind of just like languish on the register for 18 months. And after 18 months, you fall off the register and you have to start all over again, which to me would be like the most brutal way to go through that process. You know, you've taken so long to get there, you sit there for 18 months and then you don't get a job and you have to start over. So those language points can actually be really beneficial. And the other thing they give you points for is if you have military service. I can't remember the specifics with military service, but if you have military service, you can also get bonus points to bump you up on the register.
Great, thanks. That is actually way more detailed than I would have ever expected. That's great to know. Our next question comes from Tara. Tara, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for all your insight. You mentioned a little while back, I know it's been a while since you took the exam, but you said that people often say you can't prep for the FSOT, but since you did have tips for that, I was wondering if you also have any advice on preparing for the oral assessment, that last stage of the process.
Yeah, the oral assessment, it's a beast. It's I would say it's one of the longest days of my life. The best way to prep, if you're at that stage, first off, congratulations for getting that far. That is an accomplishment. The best way to prep, I think the Yahoo group still exists, which is comical because where else do you find Yahoo groups? But there is a Yahoo group that has been around for years that people used. Slightly more relevant is the subreddit. So there's a bunch of different subreddits. I mean, there's like r/FSOT, which is the Foreign Service Officers Test, I think, Foreign Service something test. So there's a subreddit specifically for taking the test. I was actually just looking at it before this to see what was on there. And so I think there's a subreddit for the oral assessment as well. And basically check out the subreddit or see if the Yahoo group still exists. With either one of those, you should be able to find people who are actively scheduling practice sessions. So the oral assessment is comprised of 3 sections. The first one is the group exercise, probably the most stressful. You're thrown into a room with a bunch of people who you've just met, anywhere between, I think maybe 3 would be the smallest group and like up to 8 is the most. You're sat at a circular table. You're all given packets of information. There are proctors sitting in each corner of the room, and you're basically given probably a total of like an hour and a half to effectively solve a problem, but like not everybody can be a winner, if that makes sense. You all have your own individual information. You're all advocating for something, but at the end of the day, the group has to come to a consensus, and kind of some people are part of the solution and some people aren't. It's not a great way of explaining how it works, but just know it's a group exercise, it's quite stressful. And so that is one thing you can practice with people beforehand. Again, the subreddit or the Yahoo group, both great resources. After that, there's a writing exercise that you do, a timed writing exercise. And then there is like a standard interview where it was kind of 2 people sitting in chairs, me sitting in a tiny room, and they just rapid fire questions at you. Some of them are scenarios, where like a common scenario is, you're at the embassy and a militant group has stormed the gates. What's the first thing you do? And the situation will progressively escalate, and you just kind of have to talk your way through it. Not the type of situation most people are accustomed to thinking about. So they do those scenarios. And then they do just like a standard where they ask you questions like, why do you want to join the Foreign Service? Tell me about a weakness, typical job interview stuff. So those are the 3 sections of the in-person interview. And then they give you your results at the end of that day. So it started at 6:30 in the morning, I think. And then you finish by like 4 o'clock and they tell you right there if you've passed or not. They pulled me into the room. I was the last one of my group to get to go. They pulled me into the room and sat me down with one of the proctors. And I'm exhausted and I'm totally nervous and I have no idea if I passed or not. And she says, let me be the first to congratulate. And like before, I basically blacked out. Like I didn't actually pass out, but I might as well have. I was so exhausted when I found out I passed. So again, long answer to that question, but the Reddit, the subreddit and the Yahoo group, like just if you're prepping for the test or for the OA, like throw yourself into as many of those groups as you can. There's spreadsheets that exist where people are posting like, hey, this weekend at this time, I'm going to do the written exercise. Who wants to do it with me? And you can sign up for it. And in advance of taking the oral exam, I just did as many of those as I possibly could. You just want to get yourself to a point where you're as comfortable and familiar with that process as possible, so you're not going to be surprised by anything.
That's great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. Warren has his hand raised. So Warren, you can go ahead and go next. I just put something in the chat too.
Hi, greetings from Atlanta, Adam Senpai. My name is Warren. I'm currently working in Georgia Tech's Office of International Education as a student and scholar advisor, but I'm also a fellow alumni of the JET program. I was a CIR in Hiroshima City from 2009 to 2012. But yeah, going back to your mentioning of choosing that public diplomacy career track or cone when you first sat for the Foreign Service Officer test, I was wondering if you could share a bit about how you chose that track and any particular steps you took in the lead up to that very crucial decision.
Yeah, good question. Always nice to meet a fellow Jet. Would love to swap Japan stories with you at some point. It's tricky, honestly. Like, I looked at that. It's funny thinking back, like from where I'm sitting now to when I was actually making that decision, and it does like. I was just having a conversation with colleagues of mine about it, like how there is something a little bit strange about the fact that they make you make that decision so early in the process. And now where I'm at right now, if I would make the same decision. So like I said, I chose public diplomacy. When I made that decision, I really knew very little about what that actually meant. You can read stuff online and it will give you like a general breakdown. There's tons of books out there that you can read. There's like a really common one that people read. It's something like, Life Inside a US Embassy or something like that. And it's dry and it's boring, but it gives you like some foundation for like what the life is like, and it breaks down the different cones. For me, I felt like the reason I chose that was so like I knew during the oral assessments, which I was just talking about, at some point they were going to ask me, why did you choose the cone that you chose? Like everyone gets asked that question. And I felt I have the best answer for public diplomacy. So like for me, it was the best way to get the job. It was a completely strategic choice. I don't regret it in the slightest, and I probably would still choose it based off of what I know now. I think so again, it's political, economic, management, which is like managing the embassy, managing the consulate, the day-to-day functions of the, working with local staff down to like the gardeners, that's management. Housing and things like that falls under the purview of management. And then consular, which is all the work I'm doing right now. If I were choosing again, I'd probably still choose public diplomacy, even though the political side is, I think, probably what's most interesting. I really liked foreign affairs. I really liked foreign policy. It is like something I enjoy reading about. I guess if you're anyone who like the idea of like picking up The Economist and just reading it is something you enjoy, then like, yeah, the political side is probably something that you would find, quite interesting. But the political side is also a ton of writing. And I don't have a problem with writing. It's just not necessarily what I want to spend my waking hours doing. They have to write a lot of reports. They have to write a lot of cables. And that side of it is less appealing to me. The public diplomacy side is a lot more like out engaging with people. I got to do a rotation with our public diplomacy team in Shanghai for 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, I got to do like a happy hour with foreign journalists at the residence of the consulate general. Consulate general is like the highest ranking person in a consulate, like the ambassador is at an embassy, consulate general is at a consulate. So for me, like finishing up work and then going over to the CG's residence, which is this like beautiful 35th floor apartment with views over Shanghai. And we've got journalists from like Bloomberg and Reuters and, name the big publications. Actually, not as many of the publications because it's China and a lot of them have left. But the big publications that are still in China, you've got the foreign journalists from all those publications, and you're sitting around and sipping wine and just like chatting with them. And to me, that was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm getting paid, which technically I wasn't because after work. And, but I mean, it's like, I would do that any night. And so that's not what you're doing every day as a public diplomacy officer, certainly. But those types of experiences and those types of opportunities, that is really appealing to me. The fact that like part of my job means you need to get out and you need to be interacting with people. You are kind of the face of the embassy, of the consulate, of the US government. That aspect of it is appealing to me, and I feel like it kind of suits my skill set quite well, to sound really tacky and businessy. But at the end of the day, I chose it because when I was asked that question in the interview, why did you choose public diplomacy? My career working in sales, working in the travel industry, being a tour guide, having been like an SAT tutor before that, like having taught JET, like the fact that I could lean on experience that I had that was like, I've spent my entire career up in front of groups of people. I've given talks, I've given prepared speeches, I've done off the cuff, I'm comfortable in this role. And this is something that I can do this, I can do it well. I have the resume to show it. And I'm excited to do it in a role for the US government. My answer when I gave it was much better than what I just said right there. But just, it fit best with my background. And I think it would have been tougher for me to sell, like, I want to be a political officer because I think foreign policy is interesting. Like, that's not going to get you the job at the end of the day. So being able to tie it to your experience and being able to demonstrate, here's what I've done in my career that is going to put me in a position to succeed in this role. I think that was ultimately the strategic decision that I made. And I think it worked out. Talk to me in 2 years when I'm actually working in a PD position, and I'll update you and let you know.
Great, thanks so much. Anna has her hand up. You want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Adam, for all those insights. I mean, who would have thought that Reddit would have been a good place to go to study? I certainly didn't know that. But I guess this will kind of be a wrap-up question. Foreign service involves a lot of traveling, being away from your family oftentimes. What keeps you grounded when you're, when all this craziness in your life is going on? How do you just, go back to reality, and what keeps you grounded in that sort of way?
Ooh, that is a tough question. And it's like having spent like roughly 8 years of my adult life living abroad. I then transitioned into about a decade living in the Bay Area, where I was still traveling a lot, but I was, I planted roots. That was home, and my family's in Southern California. I'd go see them all the time. And I absolutely loved living in the Bay Area. When this opportunity presented itself, I knew I wasn't going to turn it down. There was no hesitation for me. I knew I was taking this. But I also knew it meant I was uprooting my life again, in a way that that had kind of run its course for me when I was in my 20s. And then I moved to South America and I did my master's program. And I finally got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm kind of tired of this. I'm ready to go back home. I'm ready to go back to the US. I'm ready for a little bit more stability in my life. And then fast forward a decade later, and I'm like, oh, I've kind of come full circle. It's almost like I'm 24, about to take off and go live in northern Japan, and totally uproot my life. And part of me kind of felt like I've done this before. I know what to expect, and it'll be easier this time. And the reality is it's not any easier. And I'm sure people on this call, if you're interested in the foreign service, a lot of people probably have international experience. A lot of people have lived abroad, even studying abroad. You know what that experience is like, of being just kind of dropped into a new country, a new culture, somewhere where you don't speak the language that well. And I can tell you, I studied Chinese full-time for 8.5 months, and my Chinese is terrible. I'm not happy about that, but it is the reality. And so it's tough. And my family's all still in the US. My girlfriend lives in DC, and we decided to not have her move out for this tour. We'll certainly do the next tour together. And so being completely disconnected from your support system, it's tough. It's challenges. And what you find is you have like amazing days out there where like, you're just like, oh my God, I'm so lucky to be here. Like, what an amazing job I have. I can't believe I get paid to do this. Like, I can't believe I'm living in Shanghai at a time when it's like so fascinating to be in China, and it really is. And you just feel incredibly lucky to be in the position. And then you have days when you're just like, this sucks, and I want to be back in the US. Like, I want to be comfortable again. And what it really comes down to is like, it's your comfort zone. You know, life for me in the US, and I would assume for a lot of people on this call, you have your comfort zone. You're surrounded by, you know, your friends and your family, and you have your places you go. And, you know, if you choose to go outside of that comfort zone, you can. Hopefully not too many of us are forced outside of that comfort zone more often than we want to be. But choosing to then go live in another country, you know, you kind of relinquish that control. You find yourself outside of your comfort zone more often than you want to be. And sometimes that can be great. And like, that's where growth happens. And that's why a large part of why I wanted this job. And sometimes it's just like, it's frustrating and it's tough. And I think for me, you know, to answer your question, like routine is a big part of it. Having some semblance of normalcy. And so like, you know, I wake up the same time every morning. I get up, and as cheesy as this sounds, like I get up and I go for a run. And like, my run is like 10 minutes. So it's not like I'm like out running marathons or anything, but like every morning I get up, I go and do that. I try to start my day in a pretty consistent way. And I have calls with my family every week, which actually is something that started happening during COVID. Like, my family's all in the US at that time. I was in the Bay Area, and during COVID, we couldn't see each other. So we started doing weekly calls, and you realize like, wow, this is actually really nice. Like, it's really nice to connect with them on this consistent basis. My girlfriend and I have a routine of talking in the morning and talking in the evening, like navigating the time zone differences. But it's just, you know, for me, it's like, it's finding those things to anchor yourself to, and knowing that like the rest of my day, I'm kind of filling in the blanks, and who knows what China's going to throw at you today. Here in Doha, it's a little bit more predictable, I would say, than it is in Shanghai. Yeah, I think you need to find those things, that routine and the consistency in certain aspects of your life, and just be comfortable with the fact that other ways it's going to be complete chaos at times. And I have to remind myself, like, I signed up for this, and it's in the long run, it's great. I do love it. I love this job. I love this career. Anyone who's interested, I couldn't recommend it like more highly. But there's times when I do have to remind myself that like, oh, I'm willingly doing this. Like, I could quit at any time and just go back to the US, but I choose to do this. So yeah, it certainly can be a challenge. And again, I think anyone who's spent significant time abroad and lived abroad can probably relate to having those days where just like little things aren't going right, and you're just like, why am I doing this again? But fortunately, like, those don't happen very often. And the bulk of it's really fantastic. I feel incredibly lucky to have this job.
Oh, awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. We are almost perfectly right at time. I have learned so much personally and taken some notes on some of the stuff you've written out. So thanks again so much for sharing your experience and having that transparency with us. I hope everyone else got as much out of the program as I did. I'm going to turn it over to Ricky now, and she's just going to wrap us up with some closing comments.
Well, that was fantastic, Adam. Thank you so much. Those of you who don't know that Adam's been a personal friend of mine for years, so I've actually been able to watch his entire journey, not from super up close, but certainly check-ins. And it's been really, I've just been really impressed with someone who, as a second career, says, I'm going to go do this and take years just to get to your first posting. So you are modeling, following your dreams for us, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And it's also 9 o'clock at night in Doha. I just looked it up. So thanks for like taking your Wednesday night to talk to us. It's been really great. We want to invite you to contact Anna Petrova if you have more questions about the World Affairs Council of Atlanta's Young Leaders Program, or any other questions that you have. We have some great programs coming up, including tomorrow with professor at Stanford, Dr. Amy Ziegart. She has written Spies, Lies, and Algorithms about weaknesses in US intelligence. Next Tuesday, we have a members forum with MailChimp's Director of International Growth, discussing how a small Atlanta startup grew into an international powerhouse. And we have an in-person event coming up Friday, March 4th. We're going to be gathering with Estonia's ambassador to the US, Christian Prick. This is an in-person breakfast. It's about Estonia being the first digital nation, and Estonia is right next to Russia, as many of you know. So I think that a conversation with the ambassador of Estonia is going to be especially interesting right now, given the cyber attack happening in Ukraine. Estonia has been through it. They probably have some lessons for Ukraine. So hopefully you can join us. We haven't opened the registration link, but we'd love to see all of you in person. Thank you to today's behind the scenes team, our graduate students, Anna Petrova of the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies and Laura Brower of the Robinson College of Business, and our stellar interns, Kanko Zonu from Georgia State University and Murphy Reef from the University of Georgia. And thanks to all of you who were able to join us today. Please find out more about the World Affairs Council at our website, wacatlanta.org. And please share this video with your friends, with your colleagues, with others who are interested in this career track. I think that I learned a lot, and I know that they would too. So we'll be posting the video on YouTube as soon as we can in maybe an hour or two. So thank you so much.
Great.
Hi, guys.
Bye-bye.
Vicky. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.